Via the Cliff Mass Weather and Climate blog, they pulled an article from the Seattle Times, and apparently the people out here in Western Washington are really mentally suffering over this whole climate change fear. Among certain vulnerable people in our region, talk of eco-grief and anxiety has become signs of a psychological crisis. The University of Washington at Bothell has entire classes given over to eco-grief, and nonprofits like Climate Action Families have sessions for folks that are paralyzed with fear and grief over climate change. Some local Seattle therapists are specializing in climate grief therapy, and even the University of Washington has sessions for students. Unbelievably, even the Pacific Science Center is doing a session on dealing with eco-anxiety. I have gotten so many calls and emails from desperate folks, I can't list them here. One woman tearfully told me her mother was desperately ill in California, but she couldn't move to be with her because she was afraid of the effects of climate change in that state. Another woman called terribly worried about fires in Western Washington from global warming. A few others asked about where they should move to escape our local apocalyptical conditions. Well, I went for a walk yesterday, and just look at these apocalyptic conditions I had to endure. Horrifying. Global warming is a very serious issue, but most of the impacts are in the future. There is much we can do to address global warming, both in terms of adaptation and mitigation. There is, in fact, much reason for optimism. So, since my fellow Washingtonians are so distressed and afraid, I thought, well, I'll pitch in and help. The therapists, they're all overtaxed and overworked, and therapy's expensive, so this is going to be my Christian charity here. So let's get down to it, and let me see if I can ease some of your fears. Now, this blog points out the Seattle Times is one of the worst offenders. I can provide a few dozen examples of fear-mongering headlines, completely adrift from the truth. Like the June story claiming heat waves will claim hundreds of lives, actually 725, for each heat wave later in the century. It was complete nonsense with extreme assumptions about warming rates and assuming no one would buy an air conditioner. By the way, stories in the Seattle Times are so confused they can't even get the key facts right, with one claiming carbon monoxide, not carbon dioxide, is the problem. But where is this fear coming from? Well, it's these stories about tipping points. Tipping points that in 10 years, 12 years, 30 years, there will be so much CO2 in the atmosphere, we will have reached the point of no return, and this whole thing spirals out of control. And who can blame them with articles like this in the AFP that says, "Don't push on button of irreversible change," says top climate scientist. Johan Rockstrom, director of the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research, is a big picture scientist, as opposed to a small picture one, I guess, who strives to see how all the pieces of our planet's complex climate system fit together. In 2009, he co-authored the planetary boundaries concept, which has since become a central paradigm for evaluating Earth's capacity to absorb the impact of human activity. Today, we only have 3, 4, maybe 500 billion tons of CO2 in our carbon budge left to emit, about 10 years worth. There is no more room for this type of posturing, and yet companies are still making major natural gas and oil investments in the Arctic and elsewhere. This won't take us to net zero economy in time. So we have carbon sequestration, heat absorption, and albedo, whereby the sun's energy is reflected back into space by mirror, like snow and ice, as the three big cooling agents on Earth. This is what has kept the system so resilient during the Holocene interglacial period over the last 12,000 years. I call it the planet's capacity to buffer abuse, or Earth resilience. This scientist goes on to say, the big nightmare is the moment when Earth can no longer cope and shifts from that self-cooling state to become a net warmer. We don't know where that point is yet, but we see the mechanisms. The point when the Earth system flips from being a net cooler to a net warmer is when you cross tipping points. You could end up in a state where that resilience is weakened so much that the climate system no longer reduces human disturbance, but rather reinforces it. That will be the moment when we have lost control. When we push the on button of irreversible change, whether for the melting of ice sheets and the permafrost, or conversion of the Amazon from tropical forest to savanna, we don't want to push the on buttons of runaway global warming. The next decade is our window to avoid coming too close to those pressure points. Now, I can't quite put my finger on it, but why is this concept of a big red button so scary that leads to apocalypse and Armageddon? Anyway, so let's look at something that can maybe soothe this fear a little bit. What you hear when you hear this on button or this switch or this runaway warming is you're talking about what's called a positive feedback system. And climate scientists assume that Earth's climate is dominated by what's called positive feedbacks. So let's look at this picture right here. We can see positive feedbacks here on the right, negative feedbacks on the left. So if you picture this as like a little ball down here, if you push that ball on the left, whatever force you put in, you're going to get some movement, and then it's going to settle down at homeostasis. It's just going to basically go back to a resting point. Now on the right here, with positive feedback, if you push that ball, just a small input, just a small disturbance is going to cause the ball to run away and fall off the table and go bouncing all over the place. So down here it says disturbances are dampened in negative feedback. System remains near its starting point. In positive feedback, disturbances are amplified, run away. This is the button, the on switch. And a system may end up far, far away from its starting point. This is courtesy of Coyote Blog, and he writes, if we tap the ball on the left, it moves, but that movement creates new forces that send the ball back where it started. Negative feedback tends to attenuate any input to a system, meaning that for any given push on the system, the output will end up being less than one might expect from the push. Positive feedback is more like the ball sitting on top of the hill. Even a small tap will send it rolling very far away because of the shape of the hill and gravity that will tend to push the ball even further in the direction of the tap. Positive feedback amplifies or multiplies any input to a system, meaning that even small pushes can lead to very large results. Now he points out, almost every process you can think of in nature operates by negative feedback. Positive feedback, in contrast, in nature is extremely rare. And an example of this in nature is nuclear fission. So nuclear fission is something you see in engineered nuclear devices. Essentially, all nuclear fission occurs as a nuclear reaction. a bombardment-driven process that results from the collision of two subatomic particles. In such a reaction, free neutrons released by each fission event can trigger yet more events, which in turn release more neutrons and cause more fission. The amount of free energy contained in nuclear fuel is millions of times the amount of free energy contained in a similar mass of chemical fuel, such as gasoline. Current man-made global warming theory, however, asserts that our climate is dominated by positive feedback. The IPCC posits that a small increase in temperature from CO2 is multiplied 2, 3, or 4 times or more by positive feedbacks like humidity and ice. The long-term temperature record demonstrates that positive feedbacks can't dominate because past increases in temperature and CO2 have not run away. So, if you're feeling anxious, I want you to take a deep breath and breathe it out and realize you're breathing out CO2. Now, did this happen? No, I think we're okay, actually. We're going to be okay. In fact, dinosaurs that roamed the Earth 250 million years ago lived in a world with 5 times more carbon dioxide than there is on Earth in present day. So if there is this tipping point, if the ball really is on the hill, even assuming positive feedback, we could put 5 times more CO2 in the air than we have today before we push that on button, which means we're way further than 10 years away from the tipping point, which means no need to panic. And one of these scientists that doesn't agree with runaway global warming, David B. Cullum, a professor of chemistry at Cornell, has gathered a couple quotes. This first one from Tim Wirth was a senator, chair of Clinton-Gore campaign, and a UN official. He said, quote, "We've got to ride the global warming issue. Even if the theory of global warming is wrong, we will be doing the right things in terms of economic policy and environmental policy." This is the same guy who 30 years ago, when talking about at a congressional testimony on global warming, he carefully picked a very hot day and then sabotaged the air conditioner to make it warmer during his speech for what he called a stage effect. Another Ottmar Edenhofer, an IPCC official, said, quote, "One has to free oneself from the illusion that international climate policy is environmental policy. Instead, climate change policy is about how we redistribute de facto the world's wealth." And Mr. Cullum, Dr. Cullum here, provides this graph. You can see the projected level rise, and then way down here you can see the exact observed tide gauges where people actually live. And he points out the sea level has been rising for 14,000 years following the last glaciation. At the current rate, by the year 2100, sea levels will have risen 10 inches. Can you remember how much they rose in the last 100 years? That's right, 10 inches. Do you remember all those catastrophes? Me neither. And he points out, in fact, over the last 8,000 years, sea levels have risen on average 10 inches per century. And he points out some failed projections. We have the coming ice age in 1977, and then in 2008, our famous polar bear on melting ice. And then you can see this graph on the right. We have the IPCC models, and you can see the year 2000, the gap is getting pretty big, and you can see how what's actually been observed is fairly moderate, and what was projected for 2015 and 2020 is way out there. And so the models we were told about were wrong, badly wrong. So if you're still a little scared, you're still feeling some anxiety, here's a few more facts that maybe will help calm your nerves a little bit. I want to point out there was a 99.7% decline in the death toll from natural disasters since its peak in 1931, so less than 100 years. We've had a massive decline. In 1931, 3.7 million people died from natural disasters. In 2018, just 11,000 did. And that decline occurred over a period when global population quadrupled. What about claims of crop failure, famine, and mass death? That's also science fiction. Humans today produce enough food for 10 billion people, or 25% more than we need. And scientific bodies predict that this will increase, not decline. The United Nations Food and Agricultural Organization, FAO, forecasts crop yields increasing 30% by 2050, and the poorest parts of the world, like sub-Saharan Africa, are expected to see increases of 80 to 90%. MIT climate scientist Kerry Emanuel points out a paradoxical fact. He says, if you want to minimize carbon dioxide in the atmosphere in 2070, you might want to accelerate the burning of coal in India today. It doesn't sound like it makes sense. Coal is terrible for carbon, but it's by burning a lot of coal that they make themselves wealthier. And by making themselves wealthier, they have fewer children, and you don't have as many people burning carbon. You might be better off by 2070. So it sounds like the solution to global warming is capitalism. So I don't know. There's a few facts. Well, what do you think, Wayne? Do you feel any better?
Soothed. Sedated.
That's nice. Okay, everybody. Thanks for watching. Merry Christmas. Take care.